All right. As people are trickling in, welcome. My name is Xavier Duran. I am the Adult Programming Coordinator for the Lisle Library District. Um, a couple of things before we begin. This is a webinar program, which means the only way that you can communicate with myself or the presenter is through the Q&A feature down below. Questions will be answered at the end of the program, just so that we can go ahead and go through the material regarding fair housing. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and hand it to our phenomenal presenter, Nafia Khan from Hope Fair Housing.
Thank you so much, Xavier. I really appreciate everything that you guys are doing here at the library to keep folks informed about their housing rights. So thank you everybody so much for being here. My name is Nafia Khan, and I am Hope Fair Housing Center's Director of Outreach, Events, and Fundraising. So all that to say is I'm here to talk a little bit through fair housing, what fair housing is, what housing discrimination might look like, as well as some key information regarding disparate impact, reasonable accommodations, and so on. So firstly, I think it's important to talk a little bit about Hope Fair Housing Center, because Hope Fair Housing Center was in fact started the same year that the Fair Housing Act was signed into law. So Hope Fair Housing Center is an organization, which is a nonprofit organization. We are located out of downtown Wheaton. So we are based in DuPage County. However, we serve everyone as far north as Winnebago County, as far west as Rock Island, as far east as far east past DuPage, as well as far south as Central Illinois in Bloomington. And so we believe that everybody should be able to rent, buy, inhabit their housing of their choice. So if that looks like you renting a home, if that looks like you renting an apartment, or you purchasing a home, whatever that looks like for you, we believe that you should be able to have access to that. And what's really incredibly important is that we want people to have the choice without being discriminated against, because we are a fair housing organization. So our practice is predominantly folks that are members of protected classes under the Fair Housing Act. And we'll talk a little bit about protected classes going forward. So we believe in the equity and equality surrounding housing access. As I mentioned, Hope doesn't just service DuPage County. We actually do provide services across Central Illinois and Northern Illinois. We're actually really excited. Again, as you can see on this graphic, everything that is in red is part of our jurisdiction. We do actually cover a little bit of Western DuPage as well. Some of the Northwest suburbs, for instance, that even are in McHenry. Again, you'll see McHenry County is included in that. We also provide a little bit of services for like Oak Park, near Oak Park, Berwyn communities as well. Predominantly Cook County and Will County is serviced through the South Suburban Housing Center, as well as we also have an organization, Lawyers Committee for Better Housing as well. So we all sort of collaborate, but this is our lay of the land as it relates to services. We actually just received a grant through the Department on Housing and Urban Development. And on that grant actually was the opportunity to provide fair housing services in Southern and Central Illinois. So we're actually in the process of negotiating with HUD on the details of that monies, but we will actually be expanding our services to also provide fair housing services downstate. So that's really exciting, because we know that in Illinois, for those that are experiencing housing discrimination, many of us that are based in DuPage, we're kind of lucky in many ways. We have access to a lot of these social service agencies. A lot of people in rural communities are lucky if they even have access to a food pantry or a domestic violence awareness and shelter. So it's just really important that we, pull together resources, and this grant through HUD will actually enable us to do more work. So we're very excited about that expansion. So far we talked through Hope and our service area. And I know that Xavier has mentioned this in the beginning, but this is being recorded, so you will definitely be able to access the recording for this presentation. And yes, we will in fact be sharing the slides following the presentation as well. So thanks again for asking that. A little bit about the history of fair housing, because we know we have to know our history on where we came from in order to know where we're going. Fair housing was a topic that started as early as the 30s. National Housing Act was a piece of legislation that then President Roosevelt signed into law. And this legislation is more of a I guess you could call it a system creation bill, which means that it was intended to provide guidance on what the standards of housing and conditions of housing should look like. That includes homes, that includes apartments, so on and so forth. And it also established the system of mortgage insurance and other business transactionary type situations like lending and that kind of thing in this country. And what happens in that case. It just simply said that there needs to be standards in place to ensure that people live in a home that is safe and has good conditions, is healthy environment for folks, as well as it created a mortgage program and kind of talked a little bit through those details of how home purchasing would work. As we know, unfortunately, is the case for folks in the way of legislation, there's always unintended consequences for some people. So in this instance, we had a lot of repercussions after this bill was passed. One of them was what we refer to as redlining. And I know some of you may already are familiar with that term. It's essentially when folks that are trying to secure home loans in a predominantly minority community, they have trouble actually being able to get those loans, often from banks and lending institutions, specifically because they are seeking to live in that majority community where minority members live. This is very common. I will just give one example. If you are familiar with the city of Chicago, there is a very large Asian community, specifically Korean Americans that live in this neighborhood called Albany Park. When my parents first came, emigrated from Pakistan, one of the things that they realized was they were often being steered to specific neighborhoods. And when they did inquire about purchasing homes, specifically in that community, they were faced with a lot of barriers. And it wasn't until later that they were well aware that that was during the 80s and redlining was still an issue during the city and continues to be an issue across the nation. So again, it's when people that are trying to seek homes in a home loans, specifically in a minority community neighborhood, often will have trouble securing those loans. And again, we can imagine that creates a lot of barriers. People are not able to actually buy a home except for communities which are considered less desirable for various reasons. But again, it makes it so that certain people live in affluent communities and other folks do not access the housing. So the other one, this is something that's actually being talked about even today, are restrictive covenants. And restrictive covenants are essentially legal, it's legal paperwork. So it's an agreement that it was basically predominantly African-American members of communities that were, in the process of trying to purchase homes. They're actually like agreements that said that African-Americans could not purchase, lease, or occupy homes. And the reason that I mention this is because, St. Louis and other municipalities are actually in the process of trying to get rid of that racist language. Interesting fun fact, for those that are interested in following, St. Louis is one of the municipalities in which this is happening. Although, as you can imagine in 2022, that paperwork, like those contracts, would not be able to be upheld. And, it's really difficult to actually implement them. However, there's a ceremonial practice of being able to get rid of, our nation's history, or rather address our nation's history when it comes to discrimination. And so municipalities like St. Louis and others are actually trying to get rid of those on the dockets. They're trying to get rid of that racist language. So just interesting fact if you're interested in delving deeper into restrictive covenants. So after restrictive covenants and redlining, we also have predatory contract, which again, it disproportionately was impacting Black families. Specifically, it was what they heard called contract buying. And essentially what it is there was like a contract, again, this is legal paperwork, where title to the homes were not given to the buyer until their last monthly payment the mortgage payment had been made. As somebody who, again, is owning a property, it sort of gets in the specific, situation where you really don't have protection for yourself. And so that's how sort of the lending institutions and the mortgage insurance companies really took advantage of Black families, because they kind of led to people not being able to have any kind of insurance. By having a mortgage, by going through the lending process in this country, you have a little bit of protection once you're a homeowner. But once you buy the home and now you're in the situation where you're basically getting told, well, you really have no security on this home, it sort of makes you think, how free am I really? And then, of course, we know, aside from redlining, restrictive covenants, and contract buying, we also have discrimination. And housing discrimination is essentially why organizations like Hope exist. And that is because we are trying to make sure that everybody across the board is given a fair shot at housing. This is just a map. The reason we include this actually is just sort of, I talked a little bit about how Chicago is another one of those communities that has a history of redlining. As you can tell on this map, there's black pockets, like little, they're basically wherever, and this is actually a real map from 1960 that was in a book that just described redlining. But as you can tell, wherever there are pockets of African American members, that is seen here in black, and wherever there is predominantly white Americans, white Chicagoans, that is detailed in that gray color. And as you can see, predominantly in the west side of Chicago and in the African American communities in the west side, as well as in the black community in the south side, both the west side and the black, what we refer to as the black belt, the south side black belt, that was where predominantly black families resided. And to this day, if you look around at the demographic of Chicago and where the neighborhoods are, you will notice that to this day, west side and the south side of Chicago are predominantly where African American members and Latino community members reside. And again, it sort of just reminds you that there is a history, again, even in the 60s that continues on to 2022. It's also important to recognize that this was done by design. And again, that's why it's really important for us to curb practices like redlining, which frankly continue to make things inequitable. Okay, so we're kind of wrapping up housing in just a little bit. For folks that are interested in learning about this, we refer to what we call the Chicago Freedom Movement as 1966 through 1968. Dr. King, for those that would be interested or may not know, Dr. King's actually, his family spent a considerable amount of time in Chicago to really highlight housing discrimination practices. And Dr. King actually moved his family temporarily to the Chicago's West Side neighborhood in order to highlight the slum-like conditions in the West Side of Chicago. And again, but during the 60s, we already know that Chicago was also very much in the middle of turmoil as it related to African American members of our community, and the disproportionate impact that housing discrimination was placed in their lives. So later that summer, Dr. King led a march to our very own Chicago City Hall. And there was a list of demands that were written down that were presented to City Council that day. And one of the major ones was that real estate listings would be available to both Black and white families, regardless of where they were living at and where they were purchasing homes. And that was another big ask, because as you can imagine, that's something that was not being done. There's still unfortunately companies out here that have algorithms on their websites. I don't want to name any names, but Redfin has a lot of history of redlining and other unprofessional and racist practices historically. And so there's actually quite a few lawsuits that have been filed against organizations like theirs. There's actually going to be one recently that's going to be coming out in the news, but that Redfin most recently just settled a lawsuit against fair housing advocates, including us. So you'll be reading about that as well. So there's actually real estate listings that was available on a non-discriminatory basis. That was one of the demands that Dr. King was leading. And then later in August, Dr. King, same year, was actually struck on the head by a rock while he was leading a march in an all-white neighborhood in Chicago. So the culmination of what the Chicago Freedom Movement really is, it led to ultimately, a large part of how we were able to pass fair housing law in the country. So again, we go from 1966 through 1968, continuing to fight for housing discrimination, fighting against housing discrimination. Finally, unfortunately, it took literally the assassination of Dr. King Jr. for this country to recognize that we need protections in place for African American and other minority communities. And in 1968, again, on the heels of Dr. King's assassination, we finally have what we refer to as the Fair Housing Act. And this is the single piece of legislation at the federal level that prohibits discrimination of all kinds in housing. That is for people that are renting, that are leasing, buying, selling, or utilizing a property because of a membership in a protected class. So just to kind of wrap up this section, so far we've talked about Hope Fair Housing Center. We've discussed very briefly our mission. We've talked about our service area, and we've discussed very basics of fair housing law and how Fair Housing Act was brought forward. And now we're going to talk just a little bit clearly on what does fair housing look like. and also define what those protected classes that we just mentioned are. So a little bit about what is fair housing. Really, it's the right of all people to live where they want, have access to that housing that they want, and being able to enjoy the full use of those homes. Again, whatever those homes look like, apartment, houses, whatever it looks like that works for you, we believe that that person should be able to access that. We also want to iterate that right for all people to live in homes does not mean that they are experiencing discrimination. It does not mean that they should be interfered with, that the right to housing is based on coercion and threats and you're being intimidated based on where you're living. So that's, we do not take that kindly. And that is our mission as a fair housing center, is to end housing discrimination. So as I mentioned just a little bit ago, the Fair Housing Act was really integral in the way that our country finally redesigned housing access, specifically fair housing complaints. And so under the Fair Housing Act, we are broken down in what we call protected classes. So let me just give you an example. Because at the federal level, one of our protected classes is race. Say for instance, I am trying to rent a home, and I find a rental that I really like. And now I happen to use, say for instance, I have a housing choice voucher. Again, that means that I'm receiving a subsidized, I pay a subsidy towards basically a portion of my rent to be able to live in more affordable housing. Well, I, as somebody who's South Asian, could hypothetically, if I'm experiencing discrimination because I'm trying to use my housing choice voucher to live in, say for instance, in Lisle, in a property in Lisle, I could file a fair housing complaint because I believe that I'm being discriminated against because I'm a member of the protected class of race. So, that could look like a couple of things. There could be a white tenant that is also receiving a housing choice voucher in my same complex. And I'm realizing, well, that's a little strange. Why is that person able to live here and they're not experiencing the same barriers as I am? Well, because I belong to that protected class, I can absolutely, I'm eligible to file a fair housing complaint. Again, as you note, there's some overlap between the federal and state protected classes. A couple of those include, I should include this as well. So under sex, federal, it's race, disability, sex, national origin, color, religion, and familial status. Part of that, under sex, the Biden administration recently included sexual orientation and gender identity in that category. So actually sex also now includes protections for folks in the LGBT plus community. So we're really excited about that because that's a really big change in our law. Under Illinois protected classes, and this is what I really think is very telling to me, we already have in our Illinois Department on Human Rights, we already have in our Human Rights Act, sexual orientation, ancestry, marital status, and gender identity, as well as age, order of protection status, and military status in our protected classes. So in many ways, Illinois is forward thinking on this path. We already had in our language non-discrimination, no discrimination against these communities. But one that I want to highlight has to do with military status and order of protection status. So as you can imagine, for folks that are survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, taking out an order of protection, out against your abuser is a very brave act. And part of that means is that if you do in fact have an order of protection status out against your abuser, you should be able to access the housing without fear of repercussion. Well, as a domestic violence survivor, if you are, for instance, utilizing the emergency housing choice voucher, again, this is basically you're leaving an abusive relationship, say for instance, you are trying to secure housing. This is basically a voucher that would allow you to access subsidies to be able to leave your abuser and find safe housing. If you have that order of protection status out against your abuser, you cannot be discriminated against when it comes to your housing. So that's huge in our state. The other thing, we're one of the few states that offer protected class status for military members. So service members that are active or inactive, it does not matter. You have the right to access housing. And if you notice that, for instance, you're using your VASH voucher, which is it's through Veterans Affairs, in HUD, if you are utilizing the supportive housing voucher in order to obtain, mortgage payments and to be able to pay your rent, you cannot be discriminated against in your housing. So that's really important to note because, again, Illinois is one of the few states where veterans and survivors of DV and sexual assault are in fact protected. So we've gone through history of fair housing. We've talked a little bit through protected classes. Now I'm just going to give you a sample of what the services look like if you are in fact a member of a protected class. So when you contact HOPE, we do an intake process. Like most intake processes, what that looks like is we make a phone call. I mean, you are making a phone call to us and you're basically asking us, hey, you know, I'm experiencing housing discrimination. This is the information of what has happened. If you have any documentation, whether it's emails, phone calls, anything that would kind of back up or provide context for the case that you're trying to build upon to us, we need that information. And then we take that information and we bring it to what we call our complaint committee. The complaint committee is made up of our staff at HOPE that help enforce fair housing law. And that organization of people, that group of people, decide what we do next with the intake information. Sometimes we go ahead and feel, okay, that information is actually more appropriate for a different entity. So say, for instance, we have a case that is not like something that HOPE can take on, but another fair housing agency can take on, or a legal aid organization can take on, then we refer that person to that entity. But if we are in the process of reviewing that complaint and we do think this is actually going to make a great case for us to pursue, then we take it to testing. So I don't know if you guys have ever heard of secret shoppers before, but we do secret shopping of our own. We do what we call testing. And essentially what testing is we go through a training process where we get folks who are called testers and we train them to take down information that would help us in bringing forth evidence in support of somebody experiencing housing discrimination. So what these people do is, this is a paid job, by the way. So if you're interested in testing, definitely let us know. You basically are trained on a variety of methods. Mostly it's going to be note taking, listening, and writing down your observations. But essentially what we do is, if we're testing for race, we will send out a Latino gentleman on a Monday to a property after inquiring about it. And you're going to go show up to the property and you're going to talk to the whether it's the broker or realtor or the leasing agent or even the property manager and landlord themselves. And you're going to just have a chat with them, talk a little bit about the property, ask them, for a showing, get some questions answered. And while this is happening, that gentleman is actually recording what's happening. He's taking that entire criteria that HOPE has, and he's taking very careful notes to see what is happening during this interaction. So if we're testing for race, we'll send out a white woman, maybe 2 days later, same time, same property. And essentially, when we gather this information between both of those testers, if we're testing for race, we're going to take that information that they gathered, put it in a report, and we use that for evidence when we are testing and using that evidence in fair housing violations that we're investigating. So that is a very important tool because, again, this is used through the Department on Housing and Urban Development. It is a covert operation, so we don't tell anybody we're doing it. The whole point is it needs to be as unbiased and as fact-based as possible. It's very, objective, not subjective. And then, say for instance, that complaint committee goes ahead and says, okay, we're going to go ahead and test this property and we'll collect that information. That's one course of action. The next possibility is if we, look at the complaint that person gave us and we know that there's other ways that we can collect evidence, then we'll, maybe interview witnesses. We'll do research on the property company. We'll go through other avenues to get to an answer. So either way, whether we test that property or we go through a non-testing investigation, we then have to analyze the info we learn. So that's where we either go into an informal resolution, is we advocate for the client. So we, come together with the complainant as well as the respondent. Again, that's the person that's doing the discrimination. We come to, agree on a resolution together. Now, for those that do not want to play nicely, because there are people in the sandbox that don't want to play nicely, we do have to take it to court and often file things like HUD complaints against that person through the Department on Housing and Urban Development. We also reach out in court. So at the state level and federal court, we do actually take cases all the way to federal level if we need to. But often these things do get resolved on the advocacy or the informal resolution section. I don't want to, be unclear. Definitely definitely important to recognize that that's why education and outreach like this forum today is so incredibly important. We don't want to get to the point where we have to take people to court under enforcement action. That's not necessary, right? It's not like it's going to help anybody for us to take things to court all the time. That's definitely not going to, help anybody out anyway. So it's just really important that we have that explanation and that we, really make it a point to prioritize advocacy as opposed to just going to court for everything. So just kind of want to talk a little bit through that. We already know why fair housing is important. Housing impacts everything in your life. We've really stressed the importance of talking through reasonable accommodations in this presentation, because we know that on top of race-based claims of discrimination, the other housing discrimination we get a lot of has to do with people with disabilities. And so really quick, I want to give you a little bit of information on that. People that have disabilities, and again, what is considered a covered disability under our laws, it's somebody that has a mental or physical medical condition, and it substantially, limits one or more major life activities. For some people, that looks like breathing. So somebody with COPD, that is a disability. For some people that are low vision or are blind, hard of hearing or deaf, people that perhaps have an intellectual disability and they are unable to take care of their self-care skills, or they are not able to take care of their various self-care needs, that is considered a disability. And that's just really important to note, because any disability, frankly, a disability is something that affects one or major life activities. So that's really important to kind of note that. There are 3 different laws in our country so far that have impacted the disability community. We already know that the Fair Housing Act is one, but we also have Section 504 of the Rehab Act, as well as the ADA. And for those that don't know, the Rehab Act was the first law that really talked about anything as it related to people that received recipients of federal financial assistance. And essentially it spelled out exactly what the reasonable accommodations had to look like. So for people that had physical disabilities, that were deaf, hard of hearing, blind, or have low vision, they had to have units that were designed specifically for their disabilities. And it really talked about the need for any buildings that were leased or for federal government, that they had to be accessible. And then we move on to the ADA and the Americans with Disabilities Act, among a lot of other things, specifically talked through what kind of buildings had to be accessible. Basically, any public area has to be accessible. Any property that's owned by state and local government has to be accessible, and reasonable accommodations. That's where we come in. For folks that don't know, reasonable accommodation or reasonable modification, reasonable accommodation is basically something that is a rule or policy that needs to be changed so that a person with a disability can utilize that the same way that somebody who does not have a disability can utilize. And when it comes to housing, that can look like different things. One that we always get calls about has to do with tenants that want to have, or even folks that live in a condo association that are advocating for a service animal, and accessible parking and tenants that want a service animal because they need it based on their disability. They are the 2 most common reasonable accommodation requests that get denied every time. And we really advocate very strongly for our clients, especially those that have disabilities, because we do believe at Hope that everybody has the right under our laws to accept and have their reasonable accommodation approved. And again, we're not asking for somebody to have like a glitzy, glammed out wheelchair ramp. That's not what we're trying to do. We're just simply making sure that their rights are followed and that anybody that is needing a reasonable accommodation gets it. And then the other one, that you don't really think about, but it's, common during COVID, mental health disabilities are a very important one that we have to advocate for. Often there are property managers and landlords that don't know the law, or perhaps they do know the law, but they just use threats and don't educate themselves. We often have to ask for the reasonable accommodation of a tenant that has a mental health disability, that they are able to get medical treatment and support prior to being evicted. Whether you know it or not, during the pandemic, it has been really clear that folks are being threatened with eviction at a much higher rate for a variety of reasons. And one of the ways that, unfortunately, that folks get around following the laws is to tell people that, oh, this person is disrupting the rest of my residents. And so that person needs to get help and they cannot live in this facility, in this apartment complex. Or, oh, this condo association doesn't like that person is always talking to themselves and they're causing such a disturbance. Well, that's not okay. And that's called ableism. And we don't believe that that's okay. And so we always advocate for our clients to be able to receive the services they need and make sure that they have advocates on their side like us so that they don't just get evicted without any sort of recourse. And, again, we just talk about having documentation for everything. We always recommend and we always require that people have some sort of documentation to show that the person, again, that person that's requesting the reasonable accommodation is asking it for, again, because they have housing rights to do so. I won't talk too much through this bill. The other bit of disability advocacy information I wanted to share was reasonable modifications. So the same, way that we're asking for a change in policy, now we're asking for a requirement to ask, to let the person basically be allowed to change, modify the building in which they reside. So that looks like installing bathroom grab bars. That means widening doorways. That also might look like installing wheelchair ramps. And if you think about it, these are reasonable modifications because they are essential for that person who has the disability to be able to access the full use of their home, just like anybody else that does not have a disability would. So this isn't just, you think, okay, well, if I have a disability, then it can only look like this. Well, there are invisible disabilities. And these are just some of the examples that where reasonable modifications would be present. So discriminatory practices, a couple of things that I want to just kind of remind people for folks that are interested in learning a little bit more, and we're kind of wrapping up here. So I just want to make sure I provide the most up-to-date info for you. Fair housing violations are basically when there's a prohibited act against a protected class. Then it's considered illegal discrimination. So an overt example or an example of clear blatant discrimination is if you were refusing to rent to someone, which is illegal because they have children. Familial status is a protected class. So refusing to rent to someone because they have children is legal. On the other side, if we're talking about differential treatment, now this isn't the same as overt discrimination. Overt discrimination is that you're pointedly treating somebody differently than another person. In a differential treatment, you're treating people differently based on specific characteristics as it relates to their protected class. So say, for instance, in the differential treatment here, you're telling somebody, a realtor or, a property manager, actually, let's just say it's a realtor, that a realtor is discouraging a white buyer from purchasing a home in a specific community that happens to be a minority community. And the reason they're giving that white buyer that information is because they'll say that the schools aren't good. But then that same realtor talks to a buyer of color and doesn't say anything to them. So that's differential treatment. You're providing that information to one community and then you're not providing it to the other. And this can have very dangerous impacts. And that's why we're talking about disparate impact now. So again, to kind of sum up so far, we talked about Hope Fair Housing Center. We talked through the history of fair housing. We talked a little bit through what does reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications look like. We also talked a little bit through the protected classes. And now to wrap up, we will be discussing disparate impact. And disparate impact is another name for a policy that, when in law, it, whether it's a law or if it's just like a general policy of, for instance, a community, it is neutral on its face. So it doesn't seem like it's going to have a negative or positive impact. However, when it's put into practice, it has a greater negative impact on one group than another group. A perfect example is criminal record status. So for folks that don't know, folks that have criminal records, they're not considered a protected class. However, screening for people's criminal records may be violating civil rights laws. So this is where disparate impact is really important. So for folks that are being screened for criminal records, often people that have faced, whether it's jail time or they have a record, having dating back to maybe like when they were in their 18 years, 18 years old or 20 years old, and now they're trying to purchase a home at 50, those criminal record screenings are potentially violating civil rights laws. So something that we just kind of wanted to warn people about, there's this whole talk about things like unreasonably long look back periods. So in this little graph, in this little chart, you see on the right hand side an example of such a long look back period as somebody that has 7 years, 7 years of their look back period, and things that are in that misdemeanor, including bouncing a check, shoplifting, public intoxication, and other misdemeanors. Say for instance, I'm somebody who's 50 years old, and I am, I was 18 years old and I smoked pot and I got a ticket for doing that. Well, as somebody who was 18 years old and did, let's be honest, we all did some pretty unintelligent decision making when we were younger. We sort of have to balance off that look back period, right? Should something that happened when you were 18 years old be allowed to carry with you when you're 50 years old, trying to buy a home? So that's really important. Or even if you're applying for housing at an apartment, that's important to give people an opportunity to actually, by a case by case basis, ask questions about their background. That's really important. You can't, under our laws and under the guidance of the Department on Housing and Urban Development, you can't expect to look at somebody's record for 30 years, for instance, and say, oh, this person was 18 years old and they got in trouble for smoking pot one time. That record is within that unreasonable long look back period. So it's really important to note that. Another one that's really important, record statuses that people don't talk about, like what they're screening specifically. So we see this a lot for folks that have misdemeanors. If somebody, we know it doesn't matter if it's a misdemeanor or a felony, people will still see that on your record. And so whether that person that you're applying for housing with is going to start at the starting of your arrest versus if you've been convicted versus, okay, well, 15 years ago. So we're really, very careful about that. The other one that we are really careful about are blanket bans. So basically that's just saying when people are just like, we just don't accept anybody that has any kind of assault charge, or, oh, anybody that has ever had any kind of criminal activity. Well, that's really treading into illegal waters potentially. So we don't particularly care for that kind of blanket ban, and we often get calls from complainants. We actually not too long ago filed a complaint for this man, by the way, who was told by a property manager that they were going to, quote, look back from 0 to 99 years. I'm not really sure how that's legal, but it's obviously not legal because we filed a fair housing complaint. You can't tell somebody that they're going to do a look back from 0 to 99 years. That's just straight up silly, and it's also illegal. So just fun fact, in case anyone's curious, they cannot look at your record for an extended period of time. So I'm done right now. I wanted to make sure that I provided some resources for folks that are interested. And I will go ahead and, wait for y'all to sort of put your questions in the chat. But while we're waiting, I wanted to let people know how you can get a hold of Hope. And Hope's phone number, again, this is a free service. There is no charge for calls. There's no charge to have your complaint investigated or anything. It's all provided through our services that we receive funding for. Our phone number is 630-690-6500. And the HUD number, and again, HUD is a great resource because the Housing and Urban Development Department has a very good website, and they actually have information in Spanish and other languages as well. We always really look to our HUD partners as well as the regional office, not just in DC. We look to them for resources because they're really good about communicating with fair housing agencies like ours. And so the number for HUD directly is 800-669-9777. And our regional office is the one that, again, Hope has to communicate with often, and that's 312-353-5680. So I just sort of wanted to invite folks to, hang on to that info. For those that are interested, because again, you can file a fair housing complaint at any time. You don't need us to do that. But we, of course, love it when people contact us because we can do a way better job of explaining the process instead of you trying to go to the HUD website and figure it out all on your own. Totally understand that it is your right to advocate for yourself. It always helps, by the way, to have a fair housing organization's name on something because it actually holds a lot of weight. And we are the oldest and largest fair housing organization in Illinois. And so it says a lot when you go through HOPE. For those that are interested in filing their own complaints, I just want to let folks know the statute of limitations for filing a fair housing complaint with HUD, it is 1 year after the discrimination occurs or it ends. And in US federal or state courts, it's 2 years. So it's just really important to keep that in mind because a lot of people may be experiencing this like 10 years ago, and now they just found out about the fact that this was discrimination. They could have easily contacted HUD or their local fair housing agency and filed in court. And frankly, they didn't even know that the law was on their side. So that's just something, important to keep in mind. And again, those slides will be provided after the presentation. So I just want to make sure people know that they can get access to us. Just really quick, you might be wondering, okay, who can be held responsible for violating fair housing laws? Well, landlords and property management companies, including property owners, are huge. Housing associations and like, for instance, condo associations do this a lot. Governments, HOPE recently settled a case with the city of Peoria. They're another one that often commit fair housing violations. Real estate brokers, we know this all the time, this happens. Lending institutions and appraisers. For those that have been following the news, there was a couple in California who actually came out and they were significantly lowballed on their house appraisal. And then when they had their white friend and neighbor, or actually it's one of their friends that came in and had the house appraised, her appraisal was significantly higher. And so that Black family just recently sued that appraiser. So it's just interesting because appraisal, like lending institutions often face violations and they don't realize that, what they're doing is 100% illegal. One, they want to skirt the law, or two, they don't know the law. And so we always mention that as well. And of course, developers, insurance companies all the time. And the newspapers that publish discriminatory ads. So like if you're on the Chicago Tribune and somebody is talking about in the housing section, like for the real estate, like for apartment listings, they put something like no children allowed in this unit, or no applications of families will not be reviewed. That's illegal language. You can't talk about familial status in any of the ads. So that's illegal. So yeah, we definitely would want to make sure that that person knows their rights. So that's it for me. I'm going to go ahead and look through these questions and see if anybody has any questions that I can answer. Okay, cool. So it says, can someone qualify for emergency voucher if they're a victim of violent crime and not domestic violence? That's a really good question. Specifically for the emergency voucher, specifically when it comes to folks that are victims of violent crime, that is not specifically listed under the emergency voucher program. However, there are other emergency vouchers that are available. I don't believe right now, currently it covers victims of violent crimes. But that being said, there are other programs that are out here. So I don't want to say no, but I would say it's not specifically that specific emergency voucher, the one specifically designated for DV survivors. So I will go back and I can actually share for you, Perlin, I actually can forward that information to Xavier and actually provide the guidance so that you can actually go through that yourself, because it actually will list on that document, it'll list all the different vouchers that are available, and specifically if there is one that would fall into that category, I think it'd be worth it to share that information. In Illinois, is it 3 years they can look back on a felony? I believe it is 3 years. I will check though with our director of enforcement, because I don't want to provide the inaccurate information, but my understanding, yes, it's 3 years. My understanding is that it previously, I believe, was like 5 to 7 years, but we recently, within the last 10, 15 years, have actually changed the law. So it's reduced. But yes, my understanding is it is 3 years. But again, don't quote me on that. I'm going to go ahead and have our enforcement director provide that information to me. And again, I will make sure I send that on to Xavier so we get that accurate information to you. Sadhana, you actually asked what type of volunteers are you most in need of? Honestly, right now, we would love, well, volunteers always are appreciated. You know, we really like to do education and outreach, but we have a lot of things coming up. Like one of the things that's happening is we have a conference coming up in April, and I have a huge need of needing extra hands on deck to not just coordinate the event, but also help with moderating the sessions, making sure that people have all the information they need to do their sessions. Making sure our staff has all the scripts for each of the sessions so that they can come in and assist with the speakers and assist the rest of our staff and volunteers. So if you're passionate about fair housing, in addition to volunteering for our events and outreach side, I was also going to offer our testing. You know, we're in need of testers, and that's a paid side hustle. You don't have to work like a million hours. Literally, it's just based on whenever our tests come up. It's every couple of months, you're going to get the option to test, and it's really fun. It's a paid job again, and you get training that's paid as well. So it's just like having a side hustle that you essentially are committing to help take notes and take information, and you're attending trainings. And we're actually coming up on to it won't be this month, I believe, but it's going to be early next month. We're coming up on our next training class. And so for folks that are interested in testing, definitely give me a holler, because I will definitely forward your information onto our testing coordinator. She is looking for folks right now as we speak. And so I will make sure that I send my info to y'all through Xavier, and we can hopefully send that info out. So folks that were able to make it today, or maybe sign up and didn't get that information, can go ahead and apply to be a tester. So really our greatest need is events management, or anybody that's interested in coordinating anything. We also need help with testers, which is again a paid job. Yeah, so I don't see any other questions. So if anybody has any other things that they want to ask, please feel free to do so. But we're really just excited that folks are interested in this. Thank you so much, by the way, to Xavier and everybody at the Lisle Library District. We really appreciate you wanting to host this program, but more importantly, have discussions around housing discrimination. Just for those that are interested, actually, it was last Monday, I attended the Committee of the Whole Village Board meeting for Lisle, and I gave a similar presentation to their members, and I talked a little bit about hope. And it was really interesting because the questions that the members were asking, the Board of Trustees members were asking, very interesting. And yes, Pearlin, we definitely do give this presentation to other organizations, and I will definitely make sure that I provide my contact information to you through Xavier, so that in the future, when we have information that we want to share, I would absolutely love to connect with anybody. We do it for staff members for various organizations. We do it for civic organizations. We even do it for churches and religious institutions and local governments, and a lot of other people. So please, yeah, definitely get in touch with me after today, and I would love to connect with you all. But yeah, I just wanted to share that, when it comes to Lisle, I was just telling this to Xavier just now. Yes, absolutely, said that there definitely are virtual volunteer opportunities that are remote. We absolutely could do that, which is exactly why I was going to say I'll share my information, and y'all can reach out to me so that you can connect about those opportunities. But really quick, I was just telling Xavier before we got on this call that Lisle and Naperville, recently at Hope, we've been seeing a lot more phone calls from complainants, specifically detailing two different complaints in Naperville and Lisle specifically. One, reasonable accommodation denials, as well, like reasonable accommodation requests that are being denied. Again, service animal requests to have accessible parking. Again, those are protected under federal laws. That's not a question. If people are protected, they're protected. And then the other one is race-based discrimination and housing choice vouchers. So folks that are receiving, again, I mentioned that subsidy to be able to pay their rent, folks that are being turned away because they're using housing choice vouchers to pay for their rent, or folks have disability benefits, they're using their disability benefits to be able to pay for housing. So those are really key issues that at Hope we're really trying to sift through the complaints that we're receiving through our intake line. So if anybody, again, if you ever have any questions or are just interested in knowing whether or not something can be considered discrimination when it relates to housing, please do reach out to us, because we're not only a center for folks that are experiencing it, but we take calls from everybody when it comes to hey, where can I find the resources on who can represent me if I'm dealing with a landlord that's not allowing me to have a service animal, or I have a mother who's elderly and her condo association and her management company that they use refuse to put in grab bars and she needs them. So, I mean, we're experiencing this over and over again, and Lisle and Naperville are not, I hate to say this, but we're noticing more coming from Lisle, more calls recently. So just sort of wanted to put that bug in y'all's ear. And again, I will make sure that I share the presentation with and my contact information with Xavier so that you all can receive that info. And we can definitely connect about volunteer opportunities and testing opportunities as well. So thank you all again for hosting me at Lisle Library District. I really appreciate it. And for those that are attending tonight, thank you so much for sticking around with us tonight. It was a pleasure getting to meet you all. I'm looking forward to staying connected with you all after tonight.
Thank you so much, Nafia Khan, and from Philip Fair Housing. And this program will be available soon pay attention to our social media outlets, and we'll also go ahead and email the video to those who registered for this class. Nafia, thank you so much for this presentation, and thank you to everyone who attended. Have a great night.
Have a good night, everybody. Bye-bye.